When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus, there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by, watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Messiah, of God's chosen one." And the soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who was hanged there kept deriding him and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said to Jesus, "Remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." I heard a story years ago about this famous preacher. He was like internationally known, and he was like a Billy Graham kind of character. And he lived to be a very old age, and as he was dying, he asked one of his many staff members to help him out with something. And they said, "Yes, sir, anything you ask, what can we do?" He says, I want you to call my accountant and my lawyer and have them come to this place where I am now." And it didn't take long before the accountant and the lawyer came in, and they directed them to sit on each side of his bed. And so he was just kind of falling in and out of consciousness, and the accountant and the lawyer were kind of just looking at each other. They didn't really know him that well. I mean, they respected and honored him, but they really didn't know him personally. And so they were just kind of looking at each other. One would lift his shoulders and the other one. Finally, in a moment where the great reverend became conscious, curiosity got the best of him. And the lawyer looked at him and said, "Sir, we are so honored that you have asked us to be with you as you make this final transition from this life to the next. But honestly, we're a little confused. Why did you ask us to be here on each side of you as you breathe your last breath?" And the great reverend spoke up and he said, "Jesus died between two criminals. I thought it appropriate that I do the same." Hopefully I did not offend the lawyers and the accountants. And if I did, we are fully insured. But when we look at this passage, we see that Jesus was having a very, very bad day. Am I right? He did nothing illegal. All he did was give humanity hope. All he did was present to humanity an accurate picture of God and God's grace. All he did was give hope and healing to people who needed it so desperately. But in doing so, he created a huge following that became a threat to the status quo, both religiously and politically. And whenever you become a big enough threat to the status quo, they feel that there's only one thing they can do with you, because now it's getting out of control, and that is to kill you. And that's been something throughout the ages that people in power think they need to do in order to gain control. I remember hearing Nelson Mandela interviewed, and they said, "What did you think when you were put into prison?" He said, "I won." "Well, what would have happened if they had martyred you while you were there?" He said, "I won. Because while I am in prison, people still have hope. If they killed me, then I would have become a martyr, and the cause would have continued either way," you see. But not only is it bad enough to be arrested, to be scourged, to be beaten, and then nailed to a cross, but then on top of that, you have people deriding and mocking you. If you're the king of the Jews, if you're the Messiah like you say you are, save yourself and come on down from there. And they laughed and they go. And if it's not bad enough to have the soldiers mocking you and giving you sour wine, nailing you to a cross, if that's not bad enough, the religious leaders mocking you and making fun of you. And on top of that, one of the criminals next to you who's getting the same fate as you is now mocking you. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a bad day. And yet, somewhere in the spirit of Jesus, who was beaten, I'm sure whose body was in shock, who was in incredible pain, found the spirit within him to be able to say, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. So there are several things that we can learn from this passage. And I want us just to kind of look at the data that's here. One of the things that we can learn from it is that very religious and devout people do not necessarily mean they're going to be humane and generous people. A couple of weeks ago on 60 Minutes, I saw a report on a man who's a journalist, and he was in Syria, and he was captured by some Islamic extremists, and he was tortured. And he says, and while they're torturing you, you cannot scream out profanities, because that is offensive to them and their religion. And that by no means is painting a bleak picture upon Islam. Remember in the 60s, there used to be a group of people who would take a burning cross and place it in the yard of African Americans or in churchyards of African Americans, and they were called the Ku Klux Klan, and they were a Christian organization. Abuse of religious powers is something that all religions have a history of. So one of the things that we learn about this is you can be a devoutly religious person but still be missing something. There's something else that's needed along with our religion. Another thing that we see in this story is that Jesus has the capacity, even as he's dying, to offer hope and comfort for those around him. It's pretty amazing. There's another character in the story, the one who is sympathetic to Jesus, who stands up for him, and who admits his wrongdoing and asks Jesus to remember him. And then the other character, in spite of the fact that he's being punished for his misdeeds, he is mocking and deriding Jesus and has no respect for him whatsoever. So what I find fascinating in the story is this. The one who had that moment within himself where he was able to be honest and confess who he was, what he did, he was able to do so to Jesus and ask Jesus to remember him when he enters into his kingdom. And Jesus says to him, today you will enter into paradise with me. On the other hand, you have a guy who, in spite of all that's going on, confesses nothing, admits nothing, and still remains an arrogant jerk even on the cross. Being nailed to a cross is not humbling enough to get you to come to your mind and come to your senses and to take responsibility for who you are. And this is what I find fascinating in that, is this. Jesus who walked on water, Jesus who was able to heal the sick and the lepers, Jesus who was able to turn water into wine, Jesus who was able to raise the dead, Jesus who resurrected on the third day, was powerless to help a person who was so hard-headed and so hard-hearted that he would not admit to what he is doing. That shows how much power God has given you and me. There are plenty of people in this world who use their religion as a justification of treating humanity badly. But then it's also easy for me to point the finger at all the baddies in the world and hope that maybe by the grace of God they will have a come to Jesus moment and change their wicked ways. But it's another thing altogether for me to look at myself in the mirror and to realize that I too have done horrible things. I too have said horrible things. I too have thought horrible things. And no, I'm not going to tell you what they are. You don't need to know. It would not edify and help you in any way at all. But come to me any time that you need to confess. I'm writing a book. If we take the two criminals who were crucified with Jesus and we look at them symbolically or as a metaphor, we can see this. They represent us because we're both good and evil. You and I, we all have the capacity to do the extremest good for humanity and also to do the most horrible things. We all have that capacity. Most of us live somewhere in between. But if we look at these two criminals as a metaphor, as an image of you and me, our ego side and our spiritual soul side that sometimes are in great conflict with one another, if we look at this that way and we are honest with God and with ourselves, we can see that Jesus is right there in between, not leaving us or abandoning us at any moment, still hoping that we will have that moment when we can take responsibility for who we are and what we've done. If you choose not to, then God remains powerless to help you. And that's not very hopeful, is it? There was a movie that came out years ago about a nun who spends her time on death row in a prison. Starred Sean Penn and Susan Sarandon. And Sean Penn's character did a horrible, heinous crime. And that nun visited with him and talked with him every day. And as you watched the movie, you just saw this guy defiant to the end, continue to deny that he was mistreated, he was wronged, he was unjustly tried, blah, blah, blah. And he's a despicable, you have no sympathy for him whatsoever. But you see, God still knew that deep in his soul, there was something that could be redeemed. And God sent this nun who chooses to spend her days ministering to people who are at a place where there is not a whole lot of hope. And eventually, she was able to get him to finally own up to and to confess to what he had done. And as they were injecting him and he was having his last moments, you see him looking at her. And everybody can feel a sense of peace because you see, like he and that other criminal on the cross, he was able to come to himself and to confess and experience grace, experience peace, experience paradise. And that's the way it is for you and me. It's the way it is for us. Because we're both good and evil. We're both spiritual and egotistical. We have the capacity to do incredible things either way. But if you're here today and you don't know paradise, you don't know peace, you don't know this grace because you still are hanging on to guilt, or you're still active and involved in a behavior or in a thought pattern that keeps you estranged and separated from God, there is hope for you as long as you're breathing. In 12-step programs, one of the first things that they do to help a person to recover from addiction, first of all, is to admit that they're powerless over their addiction. And the second is to help them to understand that they are responsible for that. And that's why it works. Right, Dale? You take responsibility. So what I want to present to you today is for you to realize that between your best and your worst self, there is Jesus. And no matter what he's going through, he has the capacity to love and to forgive. And whenever you have that moment that you come to yourself, you are honest to God and to yourself. In that moment, you will experience that Greek word gnosko, experiential knowledge. You will experience forgiveness. In that moment that you come to yourself and you're honest with God and yourself, then you will experience gnosko, experiential learning, forgiveness. Whenever you get to that moment that you can be truly honest about yourself and about who you are, what you've done, then you can experience mercy. You can experience the grace. And I'm not just preaching out of some minister manual to you all. I've gone through the process. I did a searching and moral inventory in 1992 where I wrote down every horrible thing I thought and I did, stuff that I carried guilt and shame with forever. And then I had to share it with somebody. And I knew that after I shared, I just knew in my heart that after I shared these horrible things, that this person was probably going to throw rocks at me or just walk out of the room. And you know what he did instead? He smiled. And he appreciated me for having the courage to do what I had done. And he let me know that I was forgiven, that God can forgive all things. And he told me, I want you to take everything that you have here that you've written down, and I want you to imagine you've buried it in a deep hole on the other side of the Santa Catalina Mountains. And cover up that hole and never go back. And it was on that day that I experienced gnosko, grace. The first time in my adult life I could let go of shame and guilt. I proclaimed that before that experience, I preached about what I hoped was true about God. And after that experience, I was able to preach about what I knew was true about God. You see, when we can be that honest with God and with self, and we experience the love, we experience the grace, we experience the mercy, then that's when we all enter into paradise. Because for the first time in our lives, we have peace of mind, peace of spirit, and we know that God is fully present and will always be fully present. That is when, no matter what is happening in the world around us, we know gnosko, God experientially, and we know that God knows us, and that love wins the day. Love triumphs over anything you've ever said or anything you've ever done. Love triumphs over all evil. God designed it that way. The question is, do you know it? So brothers and sisters, be honest, be true. Confess to me if you need to confess, or to someone. Let it go so you too can know what it is like to enter into paradise. Let us pray. God, you know the needs of every soul here right now.